Good morning. Good morning. Good to see everybody awake and here to get started. You know, when we talk about guerrilla warfare in South Carolina, only one name comes to mind to everybody, and that's Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. History clearly shows him he's the best known partisan fighter in the American Revolution. He's the best known partisan fighter. His exploits and daring deeds have been dramatically illustrated in numerous books, movies. So I'm not going to spend time today. You all know all about him, and other than describing a quote that Robert Bass wrote about him, I think that best described him. And he said he was a moody, introverted, semi-illiterate genius who rose through private to brigadier general through intuitive grasp of strategy, tactics, personal bravery, and devotion to duty and the cause of liberty. But you know, we talk about the patriot partisans because that's who we love and dearly. But what about those Tories, those people who served the king? Historians, particularly those from the 19th century, either ignored them or vilified them. You'll find quite a bit of bias, I guess the Carolina loyalists in most histories about the revolution in the Carolinas. But they had some interested people and a fair share of effective partisan fighters too. The most successful and charismatic of these was David Fanning. His exploits in both Carolinas are worthy of much more attention than he has received from history. A little background: Fanning was an orphan from Virginia. He had no formal education. He grew up as an indentured child in Johnson County, North Carolina. He suffered from scald head, or some call it tetterworm. It's a disease of the scalp, and it wasn't treated. The family he was living with just sort of ignored it, leaving his head bald and scarred permanently. Embarrassed by it, he always kept his head covered at all times. It became sort of a fetish with him. As a young teenager, he ran away from his Johnson County family, and for a short period of time lived in Orange County, North Carolina, before moving to Raven Creek area in what is now Orange County and in the old 96th district of South Carolina. Now, when the war began in 1775, Fanning was a 19-year-old sergeant in the Upper Saluda Regiment, James Lindley's company. Like most of his colleagues in this regiment, he refused to support the newly independent government that rebelled against the crown. He fought in South Carolina's first battle of the Revolution. It was a 3-day affair in 96, in November 1775. Casualties were few, and the fight ended really in a draw, even though the Tories greatly outnumbered the Whigs in that battle. Both sides agreed to call a truce, evacuate 96, take the war away from the town, and request instructions from their leaders down in Charlestown. But before they resumed hostilities or stood down altogether. But the associators, as those revolutionary leaders called themselves in those days, didn't honor that truce. They began arresting Tory leaders before the Upper Saluda Regiment could muster again. But we still had remnants of them coming together, and on September 23, 1775, Sergeant Fanning was one of the few loyalist fighters to escape capture by the Patriots at the Great Canebrake Battle on the Reedy River, about 10 miles south of present-day Weevil. The Patriots broke apart the strongest organized Tory resistance in the new government, to the new government, and there in the state, and they jailed more than 135 of what they considered the most vicious of these Tories. Now, although there were small instances occurring here and there, it would be 4 years before the Loyalists would again cause a serious threat to South Carolina's revolutionary government. Now, during those years, Fanning was constantly hiding. from the Liberty Band, sometimes in Indian Territory and with the Cherokees. He was captured 14 times by his own word in his book, in his own narrative, and he got away each time. It's a feat that no other person in the war on either side could claim. Now, a couple of times when he was caught, he was turned loose, but mostly he used ingenuity, daring, determination, and imagination to become a master at the art of escape and evasion. In the summer of 1776, the Cherokee Indians, at the instigation of British agents, went on a rampage along the Indian line in the backcountry of both Carolinas and Georgia. They massacred several families. David was captured by a Whig patrol before these raids began, but he escaped when the Indians attacked his captors. That was his first escape. He made it back to the Reedy River and organized a small company of Tories who elected him their captain. Then on July 15, 1776, Fannin, with some Tory fighters and a few Indian warriors under the command of Captain Lindley, attacked Fort Lindley near Raven Creek in what is now Lawrence County. Fort Lindley was owned by James Lindley, but it had been occupied by a lot of the Whigs. Women and children were using the fort as a refuge from Indian attacks. But unknown to the Loyalists, it also was reinforced by several hundred patriots under command of Major Jonathan Downs. The attack was unsuccessful. The surviving Tories scattered to the countryside. Most of them went deep into Indian Territory. David went into hiding in North Carolina along the Green River. Both Patriot militia at that time were mobilizing and going into the 4-month campaign against the Cherokees. During that campaign, more than 50 Indian villages were burned, causing massive starvation and disease that over the following winter killed half the Cherokee population. After that, the Indians were not effective allies of the British, although they did have sporadic raids here and there. Thinking it was safe, David Fannin returned to South Carolina, but was soon captured again by militia patrols. He was held on 4 different occasions in the 96 jail. At that time, I think it was the largest building in South Carolina's backcountry. A brick building, 40 by 40 feet, over 2 stories high with an attic. In his first incarceration, he was locked up for several months before being tried for his participation in the attack on Fort Lindley. But a judge found him innocent of treason, and they turned him loose, much to the dismay of most of the patriots around 96. And not wanting Fannin to go unpunished, the sheriff chased him down the next day and brought him back to jail, saying, "You owe us 3 months' rent for room and board." He says some friends helped him pay that rent, and he was free again. He went back to North Carolina along Green River where he joined a Tory leader by the name of Colonel Ambrose Mills to recruit loyalists to go to Georgia to fight at joint forces, fighting with the British down there. They were ambushed by Patriot militia. Mills was captured, but Fannin got away. Mills later escaped his captors. Fannin hid out in the forest, often weeks at a time, living off the land, eating grubs, small game, inner bark of a tree. After one capture, he wrestled his way free, mounted an enemy horse. The guard shot him twice in the shoulder, and he rode away, but he clung to that horse and made good his escape. He recovered, but before being caught again. Over the next 12 months or so, Fannin was brought back to the 96 jail 3 more times. The first time, he somehow got a file, was able to saw through the iron window bars, and he got away. They brought him back. The second time, they put him in chains, and again he escaped. The last time he was captured, the jailer stripped him naked, put him in irons, chained him to the floor, up in that cramped attic. But within a few weeks, he had already freed himself from that molten floor. He had taken the manacles from his arms and legs. He slithered down the chimney and escaped naked into the woods in the dead of winter. It was February 1779. He managed to survive somehow and eventually found a friendly family to give him shelter. And by this time, the Patriot authorities were frustrated and, quite frankly, mad as hell about that. They sent word to the people who knew him that if he didn't turn himself in, the Patriots were going to put dozens of his friends in prison, confiscate their land, homes, livestock, and put their women and children out into the cold with only the clothes on their back. Fanning did not want to see his family suffer on his behalf, so he surrendered, not to Colonel Williamson's group, but to another colonel in the New Acquisition militia. And by now he'd been on the run 3.5 years. He was worn out. It was spring of 1779. It didn't look like the British Army was ever going to come back to South Carolina. So the war, as far as he was concerned, was over. He'd had enough. He petitioned Governor Rutledge and was given a parole. Then from May of 79 until May of 1780, he remained quiet, tended his little farm down on Raven Creek. However, when Cornwallis came back into South Carolina and taken Charlestown, a call went out to all those who were sympathetic to the British cause and asked them to take up arms against the rebellion. David answered that call. He violated his parole. He organized a small company of partisans from among the Tories along Raven Creek. Raven Creek, incidentally, is a tributary of Reedy River. He was elected by them to be their captain. And so for a couple of months, they just chased a few rebels up and down the Saluda River and Reedy River valleys and looked out for any kind of stray Indians that might be coming down out of the hills. Then he was sent to Musgrove Mills for a muster they had there in August of 1780. There, the Loyalists were trying to get all their people together. There's going to be a push to push the rebel partisans out of the upstate of North Carolina. Most of these were North Carolina militia that were working in the Broad River, Macklin, Tiger River areas. Their plans were interrupted, though, by a surprise raid of Patriots led by Colonel James Williams of the South Carolina Powder River area, Elijah Clark of Georgia, and Isaac Shelby with some Over Mountain men from what is now East Tennessee. Fanning's small company was in the battle at Musgrove Mills, but we don't know what he did in that fight. That battle was a disaster for the King's men, who suffered severe casualties. It was their only disaster because, just a few days before, they had beat both the Continental Army at Camden and decimated Sumter's forces over at Fishing Creek. David's group left the Loyalists the night after the battle, and they returned back to the Reedy and Saluda River valleys for patrolling. Now, a fellow by the name of Major Patrick Ferguson was a regular serving British officer and was in charge of all of the militia and provincial forces in the Carolinas, including Fanning's little independent company. Ferguson's counterinsurgency mission was similar to that of our Green Berets today. His job was to recruit, train, and lead indigenous forces against the rebellion. On the 1st of October, Fanning found himself again in western North Carolina with Ferguson at a place called Givertown. Now, Givertown is a little bit of a misnomer for those of you who don't know about the history of that area. It's really just a farmhouse in William Gilbert, but it was a courthouse for Rutherford County, very sparsely settled area on the frontier. He was sent to carry a message to the Loyalist leaders from 96 that asking Ferguson to give furlough to some of his long-serving militia who had been down in Florida and Georgia with him and had not had any kind of break and needed a furlough to go home and see their families. But at this time, Ferguson thought that he'd put down the rebellion in the West. This was before he heard about those Over Mountain men coming over chasing. Fanning left Ferguson about a week before the Battle of Kings Mountain. We don't know exactly why, My theory is that Ferguson had heard about Bannon's ingenuity and believing that Cornwallis would be taking the British Army home from Charlottetown toward taking Salisbury and then Hillsborough in order to capture the state. Ferguson, I believe, sent David to Central North Carolina to gather intelligence so he would have somebody that he knew in the area that could tell him what was going on when they moved up. Had Bannon stayed with Ferguson, we wouldn't be talking about him today. Ferguson's command was wiped out at Kings Mountain in a battle that Thomas Jefferson called the turn of the tide of success for the American Revolution. Ferguson was killed. A fourth of his men were left dead or severely wounded on the battlefield. More than 600 were taken prisoner. And Bannon's friend, Colonel Ambrose Beals, that I mentioned earlier, was among 9 Tories who were hanged a week after the battle. This battle at Kings Mountain, by the way, destroyed 1/4 of Cornwallis' invasion army, and it forced him to retreat out of Charlottetown back into South Carolina. So in late October, Bannon found himself in Randolph and Chatham counties in central Piedmont, North Carolina. He had no credentials except for his word, and upon learning of Ferguson's death and Cornwallis' retreat, he had no direction, no mission. He made his headquarters at Harmon Cox's Mill on Deep River in Randolph County. There, as in most of the Carolinas, neighbors were split in loyalty. Neither side had control of the region. And after meeting with local Tories, Bannon's leadership abilities were quickly recognized. He began to organize a more effective militia force in anticipation of the British Army returning to North Carolina, which they did later in the spring. Now, up until the late winter of 1780, this area had been fairly quiet. There were partisan groups, except for a few isolated incidents. Neither side did much other than an occasional raid and, of course, speaking ill of each other and taking advantage whenever they could. Neither side had full control of the region. All of that changed with Bannon's arrival. When some Tories challenged his authority to leave, the British Army, which had an outpost down in Wilmington, commissioned him as a militia colonel for that region. His operational area was pretty broad, primarily Randolph and Chatham counties, here, but he operated all through this area here, including areas that is now used by the U.S. Army to train their Green Berets. This includes Camp McCall, which is about right here, and Fort Bragg down in here. He developed safe areas in Uwharrie Forest along Deep River and Randolph, Chatham, and Cumberland counties. He trained his men extensively in guerrilla operations. His influence was felt throughout the region between the Yaqui PD Basin and Hall and Cape Fear. The story of John Watterson wrote in his biography, Thomas Burke, The Restless Revolutionary, that Bannon's tactics defied suppression. His clandestine movements, usually executed by night over remote and difficult terrain, were exceptionally hard to contain. Like his 20th century counterparts, he struck at the local governments by threatening their chief political and military officials. This map illustrates the major firefights just for the last half of 1781. He moved swiftly, mostly at night, and viciously struck his enemy without warning. Believing that the revolutionaries were like a snake, if you cut off their head, the body will die. Bannon targeted patriot leaders. In one raid on Chatham County Courthouse, for example, near present-day Pittsburgh, he freed several loyalists that had been scheduled to hang. He captured the local sheriff, the militia colonel, several other local state officials, a few continental officers. In all, he paroled about 40-some men, but 13 that he considered the most dangerous and had the most influence, he kept and marched them down to Wilmington, where he turned them over to the British, who immediately imprisoned them. And this included the colonel who was commanding Colonel Ramsey, who commanded the Chatham militia. One of the more interesting firefights occurred at the house in the Horseshoe, where he led about 25 Tories to capture Colonel Phillip, Austin. Now, Austin commanded the Cumberland County Whig militia, but he was a notorious character, notorious for his cruelty. Even a lot of the Whigs didn't like him. They even petitioned the governor to have him relieved. But anyway, he kept control. He was a very wealthy plantation owner. And one day he killed one of Fanning's friends, and when Fanning found out about it, he said, "Enough is enough," and he went off to the whole thing that I'm going to kill this bastard. Austin probably had about 24 men in his house at the time, in addition to his wife and 7 children. 2 of those children were teenage boys, so I imagine they participated in the defense of the home. When the shooting started, the other children were put on stools in the 2 chimneys to protect them from the bullets coming into the house. There was a baby, and Mrs. Austin probably took the baby. She was in the upstairs bedroom, probably had mattresses and everything down on top of her, trying to protect that child. The house still stands today. It is a state park in Deep River area in Moore County. The bullet holes are still visible in both the exterior and interior walls. The house is also the scene of a dramatic reenactment every July, and if you haven't been to the House of Horseshoe reenactment, put it on your calendar for next year. It's really quite entertaining as well as informative. When it became apparent that he didn't have the manpower or ammunition for a prolonged siege, Fanning decided he would burn the rebels out. Now, Austin's wife heard that this cart with torches were coming toward the house. She knew her husband wouldn't run out with a flag of truce because he was going to be killed regardless of what happened. So she took a white piece of cloth and went out and begged Fanning to let her family go. Fanning told her that she and the children could leave and they would not be harmed. But Colonel Austin had to pay for his sins. She replied that if her husband had to die, that she and the children would die with him in the house. She would not let her children grow up to be orphans. Now, Fanning had a good, rather pragmatic eye, and had a good sense to know that if he had burned that house with children inside it, he would lose the support of the populace who tended to support the crown and gave him, they give out free reign, through the region. So he relented. He granted Colonel Austin, who he hated with a passion, probably more than any other person, he granted him a parole, and Austin